The human mind is not meant to perceive all layers of reality at once. Like an onion's thin membranes, each veil protects us from the terrible truth beneath. I know this now. Looking back, I can trace the exact moment when the first veil lifted. It was the night Pastor Mills taught us about midnight prayers. Even then, something in his eyes seemed to flicker like a glitch in an old film reel when he spoke of the powerful hour when the veil between worlds grows thin. I should have recognized the warning signs, his too perfect smile, the way congregants spoke of his gift for knowing things he shouldn't, how animals fell silent when he passed. But faith makes fools of us all. What follows is my testimony. I write these words while I still remember who I am, or rather, who I was. They say madness offers its own kind of clarity. Perhaps that's why, even as my grasp on reality dissolves like sugar in rain, I understand with perfect precision how it all began, and how it must end. The First Baptist Church of Millfield had stood at the corner of Elm and Pine for over a century before Pastor Daniel Mills arrived. Its weathered white-clapboard exterior and modest steeple offered no hint of the changes that would sweep through our small town in the years following his appointment. 6 months ago, when I first returned to Millfield after my mother's diagnosis, the church seemed exactly as I remembered from childhood. Only later would I understand that its familiarity was precisely what made it the perfect disguise. Mother had been reluctant to discuss her illness over the phone, insisting I needed to come home. Some things must be said face to face, she'd whispered, her voice carrying the same tremulous quality it had developed after Dad's suicide 10 years earlier. When I arrived, the cancer had already claimed much of her physical strength, but her eyes maintained that peculiar intensity I'd always found simultaneously comforting and unnerving. "Rebecca," she'd said on my first night back, her thin fingers clutching mine with surprising force, "you need to start attending service again. Pastor Mills, he helps people. He has a gift." I'd nodded, willing to humor her. After a decade away building my career in data analysis, I'd grown comfortable with my spiritual agnosticism. Church was something I'd left behind with other childhood relics. But watching the gaunt hollows of her cheeks and the desperate hope in her eyes, I couldn't bring myself to refuse. "He prays for me," she continued, her gaze drifting toward the window where darkness had already fallen though it was barely 7 p.m. "At midnight. That's when prayers are strongest. He says the veil is thinnest then. The veil. Between here and there," she'd whispered, and something in her tone raised goosebumps along my arms. "Between what we see and what truly is." I blamed the painkillers for her cryptic talk and promised to attend Sunday service. The relief that flooded her face seemed worth a minor inconvenience. Pastor Mills was not what I expected. In my memory, Pastor Jenkins, the elderly man who'd shepherded the congregation throughout my youth, had been a gentle, somewhat forgettable presence. Mills was different. Tall and lean with prematurely silver hair that contrasted sharply with his youthful face, he radiated an energy that seemed to fill the small church. When he spoke, his rich baritone carried to every corner without the aid of microphones, and his pale blue eyes, almost colorless in certain light, had an uncanny ability to find yours in the crowd. It was as though he could sense doubt, seek it out, and address it directly. "We are all searching," he said that first Sunday, his gaze sweeping the congregation before settling, discomfortingly, on me. "Searching for meaning in a world that seems increasingly chaotic. But what if I told you that chaos is merely order we haven't yet comprehended? What if the patterns are there, waiting for us to develop the vision to perceive them?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the church. I shifted in the hard wooden pew, feeling oddly exposed despite being surrounded by at least 60 other attendees. Beside me, Mrs. Henderson, our former neighbor who'd insisted on showing me the ropes of the new church family, nodded emphatically. The pastor continued, speaking of spiritual discernment and the power of prayer. Standard sermon material, I thought, until he began discussing specific prayer times. "The ancients understood what we have forgotten," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than his previous declarations. "There are hours when the spiritual realm draws nearer to our own. Midnight, the turning point from one day to the next, marks a liminal space where prayer penetrates the veil with particular efficacy." I found myself leaning forward, drawn in despite my skepticism. Something about his cadence, the rhythmic rise and fall of his voice, seemed to bypass my rational mind and speak directly to some more primitive part of my consciousness. "This week," Pastor Mills continued, his gaze once again finding mine with unnerving precision, "I invite you to experience the power of midnight prayer. Prepare yourself, create a sacred space, come with an open heart, and witness what happens when we reach beyond the veil of our limited perception. After the service, Mrs. Henderson insisted on introducing me to the pastor. He greeted me with a warm handshake that lingered several seconds too long. "Rebecca Wilson," he said, my name sounding strangely formal on his lips. "Your mother speaks of you often. She's a woman of remarkable faith." "She mentioned your prayer sessions," I replied, withdrawing my hand with what I hoped was subtle discretion. "She seems to find them comforting." Something flickered across his features, too quick to identify. "Faith offers comfort, certainly," he nodded. "But it offers truth as well, for those willing to see it. I hope you'll consider my invitation to midnight prayer. It can be transformative." I mumbled noncommittal thanks and excused myself, blaming my unease on the awkwardness of returning to childhood rituals as an adult. Yet as I drove to the hospice where Mother had been moved the previous week, an inexplicable sense of disquiet followed me like a shadow. Mother was sleeping when I arrived, her breath rattling faintly in her chest. The oncologist had given her 2 months, but the nurse on duty, a kind-faced woman named Elaine, confided that it might be weeks rather than months. I sat beside her bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket, wondering what comfort she found in Pastor Mill's midnight prayers. "He comes here, you know," Elaine said softly, adjusting Mother's foredrip. "Almost every night around 11:30. Sits with her until after midnight." "The pastor? That seems beyond the call of duty." Elaine nodded. "He's special that way. Does it for several patients. The night staff have gotten used to his visits." "Does he pray with her?" I asked, trying to imagine my pragmatic mother embracing such fervent spirituality. "Sometimes. Mostly he just talks. About faith, about what comes after." She hesitated. "I probably shouldn't say this, but patients who receive his midnight visits seem to have easier passings. More peaceful. Like they've made peace with what's coming." A chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "That's good, I suppose. You should ask him about it," Elaine suggested. "The midnight prayer practice. Many families find it comforting." I nodded absently, but inwardly had no intention of pursuing the matter. Yet as the week progressed and I settled into the rhythm of daily hospice visits, I found myself increasingly curious about Pastor Mills and his unorthodox prayer schedule. Mother seemed to brighten whenever he was mentioned, and on the rare occasions when she was lucid during my visits, she inevitably steered our conversations toward the church and its charismatic leader. "He says there's more waiting for us," she told me on Thursday afternoon, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Not just heaven as we've imagined it, but something greater. A truth we can hardly comprehend with our limited minds." "That sounds nice, Mom," I replied, trying to keep the skepticism from my voice. "You don't believe me," she said, her sunken eyes suddenly sharp with an intensity that reminded me of her younger self, the mathematics professor who had never tolerated intellectual laziness. "You think it's just the ramblings of a dying woman and a small-town preacher." "I didn't say that. You don't need to." Her thin fingers found mine, squeezing with surprising strength. "Before you dismiss it, try it once. Midnight prayer. Open yourself to the possibility that what we perceive isn't all there is." Perhaps it was guilt, or the knowledge that her request would soon be beyond my power to fulfill. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Whatever the reason, I found myself nodding. "All right, Mom, I'll try it." The relief in her eyes was immediate and profound. "Tonight," she insisted. "Promise me." "I promise." That evening, I returned to my childhood home, now temporarily mine as Mother's illness had progressed, feeling foolish yet somehow apprehensive. The aging Victorian had always seemed too large for our small family, its shadowed corners and creaking floors a source of both imagination and anxiety throughout my youth. Now, as an adult, I found those same features stirring old discomforts I thought I'd outgrown. I attempted to work, answering emails and reviewing datasets for my remote consulting job, but found myself repeatedly distracted by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. A sound that had formed the backdrop of my childhood but now seemed unnecessarily ominous. By 11:30, I had abandoned all pretense of productivity and was pacing the living room, wondering what exactly constituted proper preparation for midnight prayer. Should I kneel? Light candles? Read scripture? Pastor Mills had mentioned creating a sacred space, but had offered no practical instruction. In the end, I opted for simplicity. I turned off all lights except for a single lamp in my bedroom, showered, changed into clean pajamas, and sat cross-legged on my bed with a Bible borrowed from Mother's extensive collection. The leather-bound volume felt heavy in my hands, weighted not just with physical heft, but with memories of Sunday school lessons, youth group meetings, and the gradual disillusionment that had led to my eventual departure from faith. I opened it randomly, finding myself in Psalms, and began reading without any particular purpose beyond fulfilling my promise to Mother. The words washed over me, familiar yet distant. I checked my phone, 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes until midnight. 5 minutes until I could conclude this odd experiment and return to my rational, orderly life. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the oak tree whose branches had scraped against my window throughout childhood storms. The sound transported me instantly back to nights spent huddled beneath blankets, imagining monstrous fingers seeking entrance. I shook away the childish memory and continued reading. 11:58 p.m. The lamp beside my bed flickered, once, twice, then steadied. A power surge, I told myself. Nothing unusual in a town with aging electrical infrastructure. 11:59 p.m. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the atmospheric pressure had subtly changed. I swallowed, finding my throat unexpectedly dry. Midnight. The grandfather clock downstairs began its solemn chime, a sound that had punctuated countless nights throughout my childhood but now carried an unfamiliar weight. I closed my eyes, feeling slightly ridiculous but determined to honor my promise. I began to whisper the Lord's Prayer, the only one I still remembered in full, when a sound outside my window froze the words on my lips. A soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. My eyes snapped open. The rational part of my mind immediately supplied explanations. A neighbor walking a dog, a teenager sneaking out, perhaps even a deer wandering through the yard. Yet some deeper instinct, the same primitive awareness that allows prey animals to sense a predator's gaze, told me otherwise. I remained motionless, breath caught in my throat, straining to hear above the continued bonging of the grandfather clock. 3 chimes, 4, 5. The footsteps stopped directly beneath my window. 6 chimes, 7, 8. The oak tree's branches swayed, though the wind had died down. 9 chimes, 10, 11. A faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the exterior wall of the house. 12 chimes. Silence. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs, for long seconds that stretched into minutes. Just as I had convinced myself that my imagination had conjured the sounds, a soft tap came at my window, gentle but deliberate. I should have been terrified. I should have reached for my phone, called 911, reported an intruder. Instead, I found myself moving toward the window with a dreamlike detachment, as though my body was responding to commands not entirely my own. The curtains were drawn, had been since I'd moved back in, and I reached for them with a hand that trembled only slightly. One quick movement and the fabric parted. There, illuminated by moonlight and the faint glow from my bedside lamp, stood Pastor Mills. His silver hair gleamed almost white in the darkness, his pale eyes reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. In his right hand, he clutched a Bible identical to the one I'd left open on my bed. For one eternal moment, we stared at each other through the glass. His expression wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked pleased, as though I had passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. He nodded once, solemnly, then raised the Bible slightly, as if in affirmation. A cloud passed over the moon, and in that brief moment of deeper darkness, he was gone. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing to process what I had seen. Pastor Mills had been at my window at midnight. Pastor Mills had stood 2 stories up, outside a window with no accessible ledge or balcony. Pastor Mills had disappeared in the blink of an eye. None of it made sense. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice before managing to unlock it. Who would I even call? The police? What would I say that the local pastor had seemingly defied gravity to appear outside my second-story window during a prayer session he had encouraged? They would assume I was hallucinating, or worse, intoxicated. Instead, I pulled up my recent calls and tapped on the hospice number, suddenly desperate to hear that Mother was okay, that she was sleeping peacefully, that Pastor Mills was nowhere near my childhood home because he was visiting her as he did most nights. Millfield Hospice, this is Denise. The night nurse's voice was hushed but alert. Hi, this is Rebecca Wilson, Sarah Wilson's daughter. I'm sorry to call so late, but I just wanted to check on her. Of course, honey. Your mom's resting comfortably. She had a good evening. Pastor Mills spent quite a while with her earlier. Left about 30 minutes ago. My blood turned ice. 30 minutes ago? He was there tonight. Yes, just like most nights. Stayed almost an hour, from about 10:30 until just after 11:30. Said a special prayer with her. Denise's voice softened. She seemed very peaceful afterward. Thank you. That's good to hear. I ended the call and sank onto the edge of my bed, mind reeling. If Pastor Mills had been at the hospice until 11:30, he couldn't possibly have reached my house, at least a 15-minute drive away, in time to be beneath my window at midnight. Yet I had seen him. Unless I hadn't. The possibility of hallucination floated through my mind. Stress, grief, anticipation, lack of sleep, all potential explanations for a vivid waking dream. I had been thinking about the pastor, about midnight prayer, about Mother's insistence on its importance. Perhaps my subconscious had simply manifested what I had been fixating on. This rational explanation calmed me enough to eventually lie down, though I left the bedside lamp burning until dawn filtered through the curtains I had firmly closed and secured with clothespins found in Mother's sewing drawer. When my alarm chimed at 7 a.m., I had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep filled with dreams of pale eyes watching me through glass. The morning brought clarity of a sort. In daylight, the events of the previous night seemed increasingly improbable. I examined the ground beneath my window, undisturbed soil and mulch with no footprints. I checked the oak tree, its nearest branch a good 6 feet from my window at its closest point, impossible for anyone to use as access without visible tools or superhuman ability. Everything confirmed what reason insisted. I had experienced a stress-induced hallucination, nothing more. I almost believed it. At the hospice that afternoon, Mother was unusually alert, her eyes tracking me with unnerving focus as I arranged fresh flowers beside her bed. "You did it," she said without preamble. "The midnight prayer." I nearly dropped the vase. "How did you know?" A smile flickered across her dry lips. "He told me. Said you'd begun to see. Pastor Mills was here this morning?" I worked to keep my voice casual, though my heart had begun to race. "No." She reached for my hand, her paper-thin skin cool against mine. "Last night, during our prayer time. But Denise said he left around 11:30. Mother's smile widened slightly. Time works differently for him. For those who've glimpsed beyond the veil. I wanted to press further, to demand explanations for impossibilities, but her sudden lucidity was already fading. Her eyelids drooped, and her grip on my hand loosened. "It will make sense soon," she murmured as she drifted towards sleep. "Keep praying at midnight. He'll show you the truth." That night, I didn't pray. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, drew all curtains, and took a sleeping pill prescribed months earlier for occasional insomnia. If Pastor Mills, or my hallucination of him, returned, I wanted no part of it. The pill granted me dreamless sleep until exactly 11:58 p.m., when I awakened with heart-pounding suddenness, as though someone had called my name. The house was silent save for the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock. I lay rigid beneath the covers, counting seconds, waiting for midnight. The first chime sent a shiver through me. By the fourth, I noticed the temperature in the room had dropped dramatically, my breath forming visible clouds in the darkness. By the seventh, the distinct smell of church incense, sandalwood and myrrh, filled the air though no candle burned. By the 12th, something scratched gently at my window pane, not the familiar scrape of oak branches, but the deliberate sound of fingernails on glass. I didn't look. I couldn't. I pulled the covers over my head like a child and prayed to a God I no longer believed in for morning to come quickly. It did, eventually, though I didn't sleep. When sunlight finally penetrated my fortress of blankets, I emerged to find thin frost patterns on the inside of my window, delicate whorls and symbols that resembled no ice formation I had ever seen. By noon, they had melted away, leaving me to question whether they had existed at all. 3 nights followed in the same pattern. I would resolve not to acknowledge midnight, fortify myself with logical explanations and, occasionally, another sleeping pill. Yet each night I would awaken just before the hour, experiencing increasingly inexplicable phenomena as the grandfather clock told 12. Whispers without speakers, shadows that moved against the flow of light, the pervasive smell of incense, and always, something at my window watching, waiting, scratching to be let in. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? More importantly, what would belief accomplish? If I was hallucinating, medical intervention might help. But if I wasn't, if something truly lingered outside my window at midnight, what authority could I possibly appeal to? On the 4th day following my initial experience, Mother took a turn for the worse. The hospice called mid-morning. Her breathing had grown labored, her vital signs weakening. The doctor suspected hours rather than days remained. I rushed to her side, professional obligations forgotten. She wasn't conscious when I arrived, her thin chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular bursts. I sat beside her, holding her fragile hand, watching shadows lengthen across the room as afternoon surrendered to evening. Nurses came and went, adjusting medications, checking vitals, offering gentle reassurances that grew less convincing as hours passed. At 11:15 p.m., the night nurse, Elaine again, touched my shoulder gently. "Pastor Mills is here," she said softly. "Would you like some time alone, or should I send him in?" Every instinct urged me to refuse his visit, to protect Mother and myself from whatever impossibility he represented. Yet something deeper, perhaps the same inexplicable pull that had drawn me to the window that first night, compelled me to nod. "Send him in." He entered silently, his tall frame seeming to fold the small hospice room into a more confined space. The Bible in his hands, the same one I had seen outside my window, gleamed faintly under the muted lighting. "Rebecca," he acknowledged me with a nod before turning his attention to Mother. "She's close now." It wasn't a question. I nodded anyway, throat too tight for words. "The veil thins for her already," he continued, pulling a chair to the opposite side of the bed. "She sees what awaits. What has always awaited, if only we had eyes to perceive it." "What are you?" The question escaped before I could contain it, raw, frightened, accusatory. Pastor Mills regarded me with those pale, reflective eyes. "A guide," he said simply. "A doorkeeper. At my window, eh?" "Yes." No denial, no explanation. "How?" "It's physically impossible." He smiled then, a gentle expression that somehow chilled me more than any threat could have. "Physics is merely another veil, Rebecca. A construct we use to make sense of a reality far more fluid than we care to admit." "What do you want from me?" "From her." I gestured toward Mother, whose breathing had grown more labored even in the short time since his arrival. "Nothing that isn't freely given." He placed the Bible on the small bedside table and reached for Mother's free hand. "Your mother understands. She's been preparing for months." I wanted to snatch her hand away from his, to shield her from whatever influence he wielded, but found myself frozen in place as he began to pray, not in English, nor in any language I recognized. The words flowed like water, like smoke, seeming to fill the room with their alien cadence. The wall clock read 11:58 p.m. Mother's eyes opened. For one terrible moment, I thought I saw recognition there, not of me, her daughter, but of something beyond me, beyond the room, beyond the thin membrane of reality I had always taken for granted. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow felt reverberate through my bones. 11:59 p.m. Pastor Mills' voice grew louder, though his lips barely moved. The fluorescent lights flickered, dimmed, brightened again. Mother's grip on my hand tightened with impossible strength. Midnight. The first chime of the hospice hall clock was lost beneath a sound like rushing wind. Mother's back arched slightly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, no, through the ceiling, seeing something I could not. Pastor Mills continued his incomprehensible prayer, his words merging with the clock's toll. As the 12th chime faded, Mother exhaled a long, final breath. Her hand relaxed in mine. The monitors registered what I already knew: she was gone. Pastor Mills closed his prayer with a word that seemed to solidify the air around us. The room grew utterly still. He gently placed Mother's hand on her chest and stood. "She crossed beautifully," he said, voice returning to its normal timbre. "Few make the transition with such grace." Grief and horror and rage tangled in my chest. "What did you do to her?" "Showed her the way." He retrieved his Bible, tucking it under his arm. "As I'm showing you. I don't want to be shown anything." His smile returned, patient, almost paternal. "It's too late for that, Rebecca. You've already begun to see. The midnight prayer opened your perception. There's no closing what has been opened." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Your mother asked me to help you understand, to guide you as I guided her. It was her final request. Stay away from me," I whispered, clutching Mother's cooling hand like an anchor to the world I understood. I couldn't, even if I wished to. His pale eyes held mine. "The threshold has been crossed. I'll see you at midnight." The door closed behind him with gentle finality. What followed were hours of mundane bureaucracy that felt surreal against the backdrop of what I had witnessed. Death certificate, funeral arrangements, personal effects. The mechanized process of death in modern America, all fluorescent lights and clipboards and signatures on dotted lines. I moved through it like an automaton, answering questions, making decisions, arranging for Mother's body to be transported to the funeral home associated with First Baptist. Only when I found myself back in my childhood home did the full weight of both her death and Pastor Mills' words descend upon me. The threshold has been crossed. I paced the empty house, jumping at shadows, checking locks I had already verified. Beneath my grief lurked a growing terror of what midnight would bring. Not just tonight, but every night hereafter. "I'll see you at midnight." Not a threat, but a promise, or perhaps a prophecy. By 11:30 p.m., desperation drove me to action. I threw essential items into a suitcase, determined to flee whatever haunted presence had attached itself to me. I would drive through the night, put miles between myself and Millfield, between myself and Pastor Mills. I would find a hotel, sleep by daylight, seek help from someone, anyone who might understand what was happening to me. I was halfway to my car when the grandfather clock began to chime. Impossible. It was only 11:47 according to my phone, yet the distinctive sound echoed through the night. One chime. Two. Three. I froze, keys in hand, as a terrible understanding dawned. Time itself was no longer reliable. The rules had changed, or perhaps, as Pastor Mills had suggested, I was simply becoming aware that the rules had never been what I thought. By the 7th chime, I knew running was futile. By the 10th, I had turned back toward the house. By the 12th, I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up toward my bedroom where I knew, with absolute certainty, someone waited. Each step felt like moving through water, reality itself seeming to thicken around me. The hallway stretched longer than physically possible, family photographs on the walls subtly changing as I passed, faces aging, de-aging, merging with shadows at their edges. My bedroom door, closed when I had rushed downstairs with my suitcase, now stood slightly ajar, a thin line of silver light spilling onto the hallway carpet. I should have been terrified beyond function. Yet a curious calm had settled over me, the calm of inevitability, of surrender to forces beyond comprehension. I pushed the door open. My bedroom appeared normal at first glance. Familiar furniture, wallpaper I had chosen as a teenager, windows with curtains drawn. Only as my eyes adjusted did I notice the subtle wrongness. Angles that didn't quite connect correctly, shadows that fell counter to the room's light sources, and reflections in the mirror that lagged seconds behind my movements. Pastor Mills sat on the edge of my bed, Bible open on his lap. He looked up as I entered, his smile revealing too many teeth arranged in geometries that human dentition shouldn't allow. "Right on time," he said, his voice simultaneously coming from his mouth and from somewhere near the ceiling. "Your mother would be proud." What is happening to me? My own voice sounded distant, disconnected. "You're awakening. Seeing beyond the constructs." He gestured toward the window. "Would you like to look? Truly look." I moved toward the window as though pulled by invisible threads. My hand reached for the curtain of its own volition. "What will I see?" I managed to ask, fingers closing around fabric. "Everything." His voice came from directly behind me now, though I hadn't seen him move. "Reality as it exists beyond human perception. The lattice upon which creation hangs. The entities that move between worlds." I hesitated, some final instinct of self-preservation flickering weakly. "Your mother sees it now," he continued, his breath cold against my ear. "She waits on the other side. Not heaven as you imagined it, but something far greater, far more true." I pulled the curtain aside. The world outside my window was no longer the familiar backyard of my childhood. Instead, a vast, impossible landscape stretched to horizons that bent upward rather than outward. Structures of non-Euclidean geometry rose and fell in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. Entities moved between them, some vaguely humanoid, others defying classification entirely. The sky pulsed with colors I had never seen before, colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum yet were somehow perceptible to my altered vision. And there, in the center of it all, stood figures in a circle, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. Some I recognized with a shock that threatened to fracture my remaining sanity. Mrs. Henderson, Elaine the night nurse, familiar faces from church and town. At the circle's center stood Mother, her form younger, vibrant, her face turned upward toward a spiraling vortex of light and matter. "Do you understand now?" Pastor Mills whispered, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder. The midnight prayer opens the door. What was metaphor becomes literal. What was hidden becomes visible. I couldn't look away from the terrible beauty of the scene, from Mother's face transfigured with ecstasy. "What are you showing them? What is that?" I managed to ask, pointing toward the spiral above the gathering. "Not what? Who?" His fingers tightened, cold as grave dirt. "The one we serve. The one who exists between realities and binds them together. The one your mother now joins." As if hearing her mention, Mother turned her face toward me. Across impossible distance, our eyes met. Her smile was radiant, beckoning. Her hand extended toward me in invitation. "She waits for you," Pastor Mills urged. "They all do. Your congregation, your family and faith." Something fractured inside me then, some final barrier between madness and sanity, between resistance and surrender. I placed my palm against the glass, and with dawning horror felt it yield like membrane, like skin, parting to allow my fingers through into the impossible world beyond. Yes, Pastor Mills encouraged, his form shifting at the edges of my peripheral vision, expanding beyond human proportions. Step through. Join us in truth. I leaned forward, drawn by Mother's outstretched hand, by the promise of understanding, of reunion, of belonging to something vaster than I had ever imagined. The window membrane stretched around my arm, my shoulder, my head cool and yielding like amniotic fluid. In that final moment of transition, suspended between worlds, a fragment of a Bible verse floated through my mind, not from Pastor Mills' teachings but from childhood Sunday school. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. I stepped through. They found my body 3 days later when Mrs. Henderson, concerned by my absence from Mother's funeral arrangements, convinced the sheriff to check the house. According to official reports, I had died of apparent heart failure, a rare but not unprecedented occurrence in otherwise healthy adults. The autopsy revealed no toxins, no signs of foul play. A tragic stress reaction to grief, the coroner concluded. Pastor Mills delivered a moving eulogy at our joint funeral, speaking eloquently of Mother's faith and my journey back towards spiritual truth cut tragically short. The congregation wept, finding comfort in his assurances that we had found peace together in God's embrace. Only one detail puzzled investigators, the curious expression found on my face, not one of pain or fear as might be expected in sudden death, but what could only be described as wonder. And more peculiar still, the window in my bedroom, discovered open to the night despite the late October chill. If you noticed when, in the months that followed, Pastor Mills began teaching a new group of congregants about the power of midnight prayer. Fewer still recognized the subtle changes in those who embraced the practice, the growing pallor of their skin, the newfound hollowness in their eyes, the way they sometimes paused in conversation as though listening to voices no one else could hear. By the time anyone thought to question the increasing number of heart failures in Millfield's aging population, Pastor Mills had already identified his next community in need of awakening. The church board regretfully announced his departure to a parish in the next state, expressing gratitude for his years of dedicated service. On clear nights, when the moon hangs full in the sky, residents sometimes report seeing figures gathered in the cemetery where Mother and I lie in adjacent plots. They stand in a circle, faces turned upward, arms outstretched towards something invisible to casual observers. At their center stands a tall, silver-haired man, Bible in hand, his voice carrying on the night breeze in a language no living tongue has spoken for millennia. Those who witness this scene find themselves drawn toward the gathering, an inexplicable longing blooming in their chests. Most resist the urge, hurrying home to lock their doors and draw their curtains tight against the darkness. But some, the curious, the grieving, the spiritually hungry, find themselves returning night after night, watching from increasing proximity until eventually, inevitably, they join the circle. And somewhere, in a reality that exists perpendicular to our own, in a landscape of impossible geometries and colors beyond human comprehension, I stand in an ever-expanding circle. Mother's hand clasps mine on one side, Mrs. Henderson's on the other. Our faces turned upward toward the spiraling entity that is both our shepherd and our sustenance. I remember less of my human life with each passing day, or what passes for days in this place beyond time. The memories of data analysis reports, apartment rent, and streaming subscriptions have faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. What remains is the midnight prayer, the revelation, the surrender. Sometimes, I glimpse familiar faces joining our congregation, the mailman who delivered to my childhood home, a former classmate, the elderly man who used to walk his dog past our house each evening. Their eyes hold the same wonder mine must have in those final human moments, the terrible ecstasy of seeing beyond the veil. And sometimes, on nights when the boundaries grow especially thin, I stand at windows looking inward rather than out. I watch the sleepers, the doubters, the unawakened masses clinging to their comforting illusions of reality. I press my palm against the membrane that separates us, feeling it yield slightly beneath my touch. I smile with too many teeth arranged in geometries human dentition shouldn't allow. I raise my Bible. I wait. After all, midnight comes for everyone eventually. And I have so much to show you when it does.